German defeat in Egypt, 1942. During the Second World War, German and Italian forces under the command of General Erwin Rommel inflicted a heavy defeat on the British forces in North Africa and pushed them back to the borders of Egypt. The British forces stopped at a small town called El Alamein, located about 250 kilometers from Cairo and nearly 400 kilometers from the Suez Canal, and took up defensive positions in order to prevent the advancing German and Italian armies from moving further. General Rommel's plan was to capture the Suez Canal and cut off the British Army's supply line, for which he needed to pass through the town of El Alamein, where the British forces were already positioned. The geographical importance of El Alamein was that on one side lay the Mediterranean Sea, and on the other, the Qattara Depression, an area of small rocky hills and uneven terrain where heavy military vehicles and tanks could not move. If Rommel had tried to bypass this location, he would have had to make a huge detour. This required a large amount of fuel, while the German army was suffering from a severe shortage of it, because the cargo ships bringing them supplies were sunk or destroyed by the British Royal Air Force on the way. So General Rommel decided to attack through El Alamein, and in July 1942, he finally launched the offensive. But after a month of war, neither army managed to advance. When British Prime Minister Winston Churchill realized how serious the situation had become, he sent his best commander, General Bernard Montgomery, to take charge of the front in Egypt. General Rommel was now planning a new attack because he had intelligence reports that the British forces were about to receive reinforcements. Therefore, he wanted to launch the attack quickly so that he could reach Cairo before the British army received further reinforcements. And then, on the 30th of August, General Rommel's forces moved on the El Alamein front line from the south, near the Qattara Depression, to attack the British front line. But General Montgomery had already received information about this attack. He quickly concealed his troops near a small hill range close to Alam al-Halfa. And when the German tanks advanced near Alam al-Halfa, the British artillery began intense shelling. The German tanks proved to be easy targets for the British guns, and one after another, they were destroyed. The German army was facing severe difficulties, but then a natural aid arrived. A sandstorm arose and engulfed the entire battlefield. Taking advantage of the storm, the German forces managed to evade the British artillery and move closer to the enemy's defensive positions. Here, they caused significant damage to the British tanks, but still could not break through the defensive line. When the storm subsided, British warplanes appeared in the sky and began raining fire upon the German tanks. The battlefield soon turned into a graveyard for the German armor. The number of aircraft arriving to support the German army was very small, because the German Air Force had given 1,000 tons of fuel to the tank forces, leaving the Germans' aircrafts unable to fly. For 6 long days, fierce fighting raged across the desert, yet the German forces failed to achieve any success. On the contrary, the battle almost completely exhausted what little fuel the German army had left. General Rommel knew that if the fuel supply ran out, his troops would not only be unable to defend themselves but also unable to retreat. Therefore, on September 5th, General Rommel ordered his forces to withdraw. He saved the fuel, but he lost the Battle of Alam el-Halfa. In this battle, 1,700 British soldiers were killed or wounded. 68 tanks and 67 aircraft were destroyed. In comparison, the German and Italian forces suffered heavy casualties. 2,900 soldiers were killed or wounded. 49 tanks, 36 aircraft, and 60 artillery pieces were destroyed. After this victory, by September 11th, General Montgomery received the heavy reinforcements he had been waiting for. Along with fresh troops, 318 American Sherman tanks also reached him via the Suez route. Now the British Army's tank power had increased significantly compared to the Germans. The Sherman tank had a very strong external armor. To destroy this tank, German soldiers had to target its fuel tank, which was a difficult task. On the other hand, a single shell from a Sherman tank was enough to destroy any German tank. With the arrival of this powerful weapon, General Montgomery now had the opportunity to push the German forces out of Egypt. Accordingly, he began planning the attack. They received some encouraging news. General Rommel had requested leave due to illness, which had been approved, and he returned to Germany. He handed over command to General George Stumme. General Stumme followed the exact defensive plan that Rommel had left for him. Before leaving for Germany, General Rommel had established a formidable defensive line stretching from El Qattara Depression all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. For 8 kilometers beyond this line, 500,000 landmines had been laid. Most of these were anti-tank mines, designed to detonate only under the weight of a tank or a heavy vehicle. They were planted in such a way that the entire area became a vast minefield, At intervals within this minefield, defensive outposts were constructed. Rommel named this deadly expanse the Devil's Garden. Behind the minefield lay a line of defensive trenches where German and their allied Italian soldiers stood guard with machine guns. And further behind these positions, tank units were stationed. While the Germans were preparing their defensive line, the British commander General Montgomery was busy in planning a special operation called Operation Bertram. The purpose of this plan was to deceive the enemy with the help of a fake army and launch a surprise attack. On the southern side of the front line, thousands of dummy military vehicles and tanks were positioned. This was done with such skill that the Germans became convinced the attack would come from the south. Because of this, they moved most of their tanks and artillery in that direction. While the Germans, having fallen for the deception, were shifting toward the south, General Montgomery quietly began moving his real forces toward the north. The British had camouflaged their tanks so cleverly that from a distance they looked like ordinary trucks. To the enemy, these worn-out vehicles appeared to be useless for any kind of attack. Apart from this deception, the British also had a numerical advantage. Along with Britain, their forces included soldiers from New Zealand, Australia, France, and British India. Altogether, the British Army had 220,000 soldiers and 1,029 tanks, whereas the Nazis had only 116,000 soldiers and 547 tanks. And then, on the night of the 23rd of October, at exactly 9:40 p.m., General Montgomery launched Operation Lightfoot. It was called Lightfoot because the advance was not to be led by tanks, but by light-stepping infantry, so they could avoid the German anti-tank minefields. Before this advance, the enemy's defensive line had been pounded by heavy artillery, and under the cover of that thunderous bombardment, the British infantry slipped into the German minefields and wiped out every defensive post they encountered. They then began moving toward the enemy's second defense line. Behind them was a mine-clearing team whose job was to open safe paths so the tanks could pass through. At first, General Montgomery's plan worked brilliantly, but the German forces waiting behind the second defense line were now fully alert. They opened fire with their artillery and machine guns, and within moments the British infantry started collapsing. The tanks following behind also ran into severe trouble because the cleared paths were extremely narrow. If even one British tank was destroyed, the entire war machine behind it would come to a halt. This traffic jam made the German gunners' job effortless. They took careful aim and obliterated the hundreds of tanks and vehicles trapped in that choke point. By morning, the minefield Rommel had laid had turned into a graveyard for British tanks. Only a few infantry units managed to reach the German defense line, and those too were pushed back. Operation Lightfoot had failed miserably, and the British had retreated. After this victory, the Germans received a morale-boosting news that General Rommel had returned to the front on Hitler's orders. General Montgomery was now preparing for a second attack. Just a few days after the failure of Operation Lightfoot, General Montgomery launched another Operation Supercharge. To divert attention from this main attack, the Allied Australian forces launched an assault on the German defensive line near the Mediterranean. General Rommel immediately sent his tanks to reinforce the defensive line on the Mediterranean side, believing that the main British attack would come from there. However, this turned out to be his biggest mistake. General Montgomery launched the main attack at the same location where Operation Lightfoot had been conducted. In this attack, the British infantry advanced, and, before the Germans could react, crossed the minefields and positioned themselves right in front of the enemy. Behind them, tanks were advancing. Germans destroyed all the frontline tanks with anti-tank guns. More tanks kept arriving behind them, and simultaneously, the British infantry also attacked. Many German soldiers were killed in their trenches. The Germans' supply of weapons was depleting rapidly. In desperation, General Rommel sent his remaining tanks forward, but the British tanks were far superior in number, and the German tanks could not compete. Now, hopeless of victory, General Rommel retreated toward Libya on November 5th. He had too few trucks to transport all his soldiers, so he placed the Germans in the trucks and left the Italian soldiers behind. The Italian soldiers surrendered to the British a few days later. The Battle of El Alamein was won by Britain, although their losses were higher than those of the Germans. In this battle, 6,977 German and Italian soldiers were killed or wounded, and 259 tanks were destroyed, whereas the British suffered 13,560 casualties and lost 332 tanks.